Hello, everybody. It's BJ Miller and the Muffin Man. Good to see you guys again. New faces, maybe. It's our monthly webinar thingamadoogle. Today we're going to talk about disability. Quick reminders, the way this works is I'll go through some slides, lay down some provocations or basics, and then we can riff off them, talk about them, tangent, wherever we want to go. Everybody on here is welcome to participate and speak up. We'll cut to that in a second. Or just listen, no pressure, but this is meant to be a safe place. So kindness, respect, and privacy, all are very important. These are shared, so this is not an internal thing here, but among us, we should feel safe thinking and feeling together. So with that, let me cut over to Lady Sonia.
Thanks, BJ. Hey, everyone. Thanks for being here. Just wanted to give a few logistics for how to interact after BJ has gone through his slides. So there's two ways you can ask a question or bring up a topic. You can click the raise hand button and we will unmute you and you can ask your question out loud. Or if you prefer to not ask your question out loud, you can type it into the question area and I will read it out loud for BJ to address. So again, raise your hand, ask your question out loud, or type it in. And to BJ's point earlier, if you would like to remain anonymous, that is absolutely fine. Please just type us a little note into the question area if that is the case, and we will absolutely respect that. Also want to call out that if we aren't able to get to all the questions during our 1 hour time here, we will record a second session with BJ addressing those questions. So if we're not able to get to it here, we will still address it in a future recording and we'll post those along together. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Sonia. And reminder, guys, too, that one of the hopes is that we'll figure out this platform better over time to do this more fluidly. But please feel free to respond to each other, to one another. We all have our entrees to the subject, our own levels of expertise, and anything goes here. So please feel free to respond to other people as questions come up or thoughts. Okay, so what the heck is disability? It's worth defining. And by the way, yet again, huge shout out to Sonia for the art she's found in here. These are particularly compelling. I mean, every time they're awesome, and they're almost entirely Sonia's work. Are entirely Sonia's work. So please know that. So disability, person having a physical or mental condition that limits movement, sensory, or activities. I mean, pretty straightforward. Ostensibly, the trick gets a little tricky around language and identity. We'll get to that. And it also gets a little tricky because compared to what's the standard? So this definition seems straightforward enough, but compared to what? So that too we'll talk about a little bit more, but that at least gets us in the ballpark. So this is not a small minority of people. 61 million adults living with some form of disability. That's amazing. That's a very large number. That's going on 20% or more of our country, of the population. 4.5 million vets with service-connected disability. 6.5 million people have an intellectual disability, learning disability, intellectual disability, much the same thing. And over almost 21 million people with some sort of ambulatory disability, some challenge to their mobility. So these are huge numbers. Unless we think disability is this really rare minority thing that, when you see lots of handicapped parking places wide open and you're tempted to wonder, why do we have, these are huge numbers. And part of the challenge here is not all disabilities are obvious or visible. And it's also kind of tricky because as a group, it's extremely heterogeneous. We're not, just because I've met zillions of other amputees over the years, and that's something to have in common, but one of a zillion things and pretty low down the list. So it's hard to talk concretely or as on block about the disabled community. And it's also true too that unlike other forms of sort of other inborn statuses like race or ethnicity, the disability ranks is a group that any of us can join at any time along the way of a normal life. So it's a minority, and there's a lot to generalize about, but a lot to not generalize about too. So be careful with your assumptions, and we'll get into that a little bit more too. Last thing to say is this number, as big as they are growing as a percentage of the population. More and more of us are living with some form of disability. And in some ways, that's a nod to the advances of medicine. We're able to help people live who otherwise might have died not that long ago, myself very much included in that. So one of the sort of the fallout of our success as a medical system is that more and more of us are able to live with chronic illness or disability, old age, et cetera, and that's wonderful, but it also stresses our systems and our ethos and our social structures and all sorts of things we've talked about here on this webinar, and maybe it'll come up more today as well. Okay. History. So one thing to appreciate, and that so I had the good fortune of growing up with a mother who had a disability, and in a family who navigated disability as a group, and so I learned a lot from that experience. I still do. One was just to appreciate disability as a civil rights issue. In my lifetime, it took me a minute to understand that myself. It seemed on face that certain people who needed more help getting through the day or navigating the planet, that on some level, maybe what should we expect of society in terms of accommodating one another's abilities? That wasn't always such an obvious question. It's still not obvious, I suppose, but it wasn't certainly not settled in the law. I mean, in the 20th century, there were cities that had ordinances on the book, Chicago, where I grew up, included, where you could be arrested if you were seen in public with a visible disability. I mean, there's sort of all sorts of shocking history. And it doesn't, so any group that's been marginalized, persecuted, disability is right up there. It rarely gets discussed as such, rarely gets discussed as a civil right, and perhaps because of the particulars I was mentioning earlier. I don't know. Perhaps because of the fear around it, because it is this thing that could go wrong, and any of us it could happen to any of us at any one time. Maybe there's this fear spectrum in the back. But one way or another, like so much of the subject of illness, death, things that we like to talk about, they get some way or another short shrift in society. So as happens as a civilization is progressing and attempting to be more and more inclusive, as it happened in our country in the 60s, there was a push for civil rights, broadly speaking. Disability rights were included in that, not as much discussed, but nonetheless so. And so this is a big, big difference, that it used to be that handicap, you hold your cap out, there's all this history of that you're out of the norm of society and reliant upon the sympathy and pity of able-bodied normal people. That's been part of the spectrum of disability in my own lifetime. This is not an ancient phenomenon. So there's a series of moments in our body of law that began to protect disability. 1973, the Rehab Act, that was a big moment, but it was, a lot of these laws have been are lumpy in terms of how they're policed. But these are nonetheless big moments of progress, and thanks to a lot of lobbying and some activism, some intensive activism. If you haven't seen the movie called Crip Camp, Crip as in crippled, C-R-I-P, Crip Camp, I think it's on Netflix. It's wonderful. It sort of gives you a nice bird's eye view of the history of disability as a civil rights movement and the people who really advanced the ball for all of us. It's a beautiful movie, but it also helped lay out the challenges that our culture has faced. The most recent, this sort of culminated in my lifetime. This is right around when I became disabled, when I had my injuries in 1990, and that's right when the ADA came online. By the way, was a Republican-backed piece of legislation. Bob Dole had a lot to do with it. And this is where it kicked up the protection levels for people with disabilities. So the access to public transport and other things that had been already codified in previous laws were strengthened. And then it became a civil, clearly a right. I have a right to access public services. I have a right to access commerce, whether I'm in a wheelchair, on prosthetic legs, on a breathing machine, whatever. We all need some help getting through the day. And so the line between able-bodied and disabled starts getting pretty blurry, which is part of the challenge and part of the opportunity. The ADA has been wildly successful in some ways and disappointing in others. There is no enforcement. So I, as a citizen, can bring a lawsuit, say, against an organization that didn't put in a ramp or didn't have doors big enough, or I couldn't use their services. I, as a private citizen, could sue this organization. So it's on us to prosecute the law ourselves. That's a little bit problematic, but here we are. So we'll see whether there are refinements to the ADA over time, but it certainly has been a major advance, but we're not done yet. So I'll just check the time. Okay. You know, one of the things that was really eye-opening to me, even having grown up around disability, but then entering those shoes and looked upon by society as someone who is disabled, that's when I really came to appreciate the dastardly nature of these projections. I had witnessed them with my mom all my life, but I don't think I quite appreciated what it's like to be on the receiving end. And of course, all humans, we're always projecting on each other all the time. Projecting on animals, we're projecting all over the place. So on some level, this is, not to make too much of a fuss, this is normal. But as with any group, subculture, any minority group, any group that's not well understood and looked on with some mix of fascination and horror, we, especially those of us who are obviously disabled, can end up feeling like a blank canvas that I walk around and everyone sort of throws their paint up on it, and I, the individual, the disabled person, can get lost in the mix, navigating all these projections of fear. I've often said from my own experiences as an amputee with prostheses and stuff, especially in the early days, I thought it's palpably better now. I mean, things have changed, but in the early days, I remember the feeling was I'd walk around and I was either sort of treated as a Christ figure, someone special, someone who had special insights, who had seen some portal that only comes through suffering or disability or some difference or abnormality. We can kind of fetishize that. So sometimes people treated me as though I had this sort of special power. And then others would treat me like some sort of a monster, like, terrified, like pull their kids away from me, get these remarkable looks on their face. I remember many times just casually walking down the street, and I used to make a point, I still do make a point to wear shorts to try to kind of force the issue that this is normal, this is part of normal life, and not hide it, not try to pass. We can talk about that if that's of interest. But I remember I would walk around, like if I bumped into someone coming around a corner or something like that, I would often notice how their immediate, before they had time to think, an immediate reflexive look on their face when they sort of saw my body was often a repugnance, repulsion, like a fear, like, ooh, it's really jarring. And then people would collect themselves, consciously sort of override that. But what the heck was that? And I don't see that as much anymore, the sort of Frankenstein piece of it. But maybe the point is already made here that one way or another, folks with disabilities are on the receiving end of all sorts of weird information, weird projections that has nothing to do with them. It's not their own, it's the other person's fear. Again, so it goes in normal life, but it seems to be sort of accelerated or more dramatic in this realm. At least that's been my experience. And it gets to the point where you realize, and I wonder what you guys will think of this statement, but if I'm just sort of as an observation, in my own experience and a lot of other people I've spoken with who have disabilities, the hardest thing about the disability is not so much the disability per se. Sure, there are aches and pains that go with it. There are new aggravations and things take longer to do certain things, and some things aren't possible. Yeah, it's a pain in the ass, compared to if I had 4 working limbs, sure. But like it is in life, you make your way, you find a way. All of us has various things every day that we'd rather not deal with, and blah, blah, blah. But it gets to the point where you realize that what makes having a disability so dang difficult is really so much the relationship, what it does to others. The way the world ends up treating you becomes the biggest problem, which is, kind of a stunning statement. That's harder than the disability itself. Hopefully, maybe we can dig into that. It feels to me that that shouldn't be so, and yet it is. And maybe it also makes a point of the built environment. If nature is rejecting me and not allowing me to live in a certain situation, that's one thing. But if humans are deciding and divining systems and built environments and man-made things where they have choice and they elect not to include people like me, well, that's a very different calculus and feels very different. And you can imagine why it's so important to have the protections of the law for access, rather than relying on charity. What a different proposition that is. And we need those protections because the built environment, we haven't had a good track record of being inclusive without being sort of required to be. Okay, I feel myself going on this one, but well, it's a big one. It's a big one. Disability versus chronic illness, in some ways, they're much the same. I mean, a chronic illness, a chronic condition simply is very much it's usually defined by some functional deficit. So in some ways, there's really not much of a difference between disability and chronic illness per se. Although some chronic illnesses are totally silent, have no symptoms, the person doesn't even know they have the illness, and therefore there is no disabling effect. So it's not a complete superimposition, not a complete overlap. But the big difference really is a cultural one. When we talk about chronic illness, we are framing it around illness. We're framing it around the medical model, essentially. And the relationship between the disabled community and the medical community is a very fraught one, as with just about any minority in the West. There's a terrifying track record of experiments done on people with disabilities. There's a terrible tradition of warehousing people with disabilities in horrifying conditions and getting them out of the view of civil society, excluding them, not just including them, but actively excluding them, us. I mean, it's a profound tradition in some corners of our country. It's still alive and well. So the medical piece is really tricky. Another thing that's wrong with the medical model is the medical model is all framed around pathologizing. And so it's one thing if a doctor or a scientist is in a lab pathologizing my cells, normal versus pathological cells or something like that. But to me as a person, if I'm getting the vibe that I'm pathological because this thing happened to me through no fault of my own, well, in my case, some fault of my own, that becomes very different. Am I pathological for being sick? Am I pathological for dying? Am I pathological for having some functional decline? No, it's called normal. So the other problem in the medical model is it pathologizes normal states of being or innocent states of being, and the fallout of that is insidious, is diffuse, is profound. I don't know if any of you have had the experience of people like treating you as though there's something wrong with you, and even they'll come to you with sort of charity in mind of wanting to fix you and help you and heal you. Well, sometimes we can't be fixed or healed. Sometimes we don't want to. Sometimes we don't see ourselves as being a problem. This is very poignantly plays out in the deaf community. There's a real pride. And so if you go to speak to a person who has hearing impairments or deafness, and you suggest that they're missing out and they should, of course, would want to hear, and here we have these new implants and we'll do all these things to make you normal. Well, you'll get a lot of resistance. There's some pride around being in our bodies, whoever we are, whatever we are. And that's a beautiful thing, a therapeutic thing. So anyway, this sort of gets at some of the historic and current tension in the medical model and why a lot of us in the disabled community are very suspicious of medicine and don't like the language, don't like the framing. I'm not, this sort of normal. Who's this normal person that we're being compared to? Disability has the same problem. Who is a standard normal person that we're being compared to? So it gets a little tricky, and that's begs in our next slide here. which is identity. Like this is so much what we're talking about here. It's it's a functional, there's some practical issues, but compared to what? Am I getting through the day? Right. Am I, like one of the things I love to say, I haven't done this in a while, but I used to speak to more school kids and talk about disability. One of my favorite moments was when someone would invariably ask, like, don't you wish you had your hands back? Don't you wish you had your feet back or something like that? I'd say, sure, you know, sure I do. But, don't you wish, don't you miss having 3 hands? You must be so sad to not have 4 feet, sort of oftentimes, I think I just confuse the hell out of people, but sometimes the people get it like, who's to say who's the normal thing? I mean, I'm sad to only have my right arm because I know that others have two, you know. But if I'm just taking myself at face value, I love my right arm. I love my prosthetic feet, So anyway, it's complexities around this, and a lot of them get into identity and who's to say who I am and what's important to me. There's a lot of required stubbornness to navigate this planet as a disabled person. Anyway, going on and on about that, and I keep framing it as a personal issue, not that this is all about me, but just to own the experience and not pretend to speak for others. So, yep, I knew it. Okay, so let me turn off the slides, guys, and maybe with all of that, we can kick up some conversation or shared stories, whatever it is. Okay. And we can talk about any of these. Those are all tips of icebergs. So if we want to talk about the medical model or the historical piece or what's going on now, or different ways to frame it, please let me know, or what we think we need to handle disability better. This certainly gets at issues around caregiving and the ecosystem of care that are hot on the policy front right now. And we know with our silver tsunami that we have some issues. So caught up in that are personal care attendants and home health aides and folks that people with certain disabilities really need to live. So this is a hot political subject too. So all welcome for conversation. Any takers out there?
I don't see any hands up yet.
Okie dokie. I wonder if my mom's on this call. Mom, if you're on the call, chime in anytime. Not to put you on the spot. Well, maybe one thing I can say while we're waiting. Sonia, please just cut me off if someone raises a hand.
Okay, will do.
So, one of the things that's been really, as I said.
Oh, wait, we got a hand.
Yep. Okay.
Denise, 1 second, I'll unmute you here. Denise, you might have to unmute yourself on your end. See, Denise, do you have a request on your end? You might have to unmute yourself. BJ, maybe you can finish your thought while she's unmuting.
Sure. Yeah, I was just gonna say, things have gotten better. Well, ways to go, work in progress. I think probably always will be. And society reconciling who's in, who's out, and what do we owe each other. Those are hot, open questions, probably forever. I will say one of the things I noticed in my own life, that repugnance, I don't bump into that very often anymore. It used to be much more palpable, and the fear of rejection one way or another used to be much more part of my own daily life. So N of 1, my sense is things have gotten a little bit better. And one of the ways it's gotten better is one day, one of the moments I realized we were making headway was when you saw, I think it was a Kmart ad. There was a guy in a wheelchair, and no one was making a big stink of the wheelchair. It was just part of the normal fabric of shoppers doing shopping things, and this guy in a wheelchair just whizzed by. There was no one making a fuss about it nor hiding it. And that was a beautiful moment to see. I got really excited at that moment because, boy, pop culture reflects us in a lot of ways and leads us in a lot of ways. And so, it also kind of goes along with body image issues. in one way or another, all of ourselves, whether it's the color of our skin or the shape of our body or the body parts we have or what it takes for us to breathe, or the full range of human experience is enormous and fascinating. And I think, at least in some circles of society, I think there's an increased awareness. It used to be stories like mine and others would just be held up as sort of an inspirational story or something like that, overcoming the odds. Well, they never said that the odds that I'm overcoming are the ones that have been projected, created. Um, anyway, uh,
It
any there with
looks like
Denise?
Denise is on now. Thanks so much for your patience, Denise. Go ahead.
Yes, yes, BJ. I've learned about you through David Kessler and your palliative care. But this question goes on another aspect. What would you say as a physician that we could do for the hospital system to educate them more about how to handle people with disabilities? Because I find as a quadriplegic that can only use one hand because of cerebral palsy that I always have to stay one step ahead of them,
Hmm.
okay? Because they don't even know how to sometimes roll me over.
Yep.
And I find that I have to stay one step ahead of them in order to say, okay, this is what you do. And in terms of my bowel care, when I've told them, you know, laxatives aren't going to work right away. You need to do manual stimulation. They looked at me like I was crazy.
Hmm. Yep.
And I'm like, you you just gotta go in, and I gave them the specifics, and the one doctor told me, he said, I'm not gonna let you go out of the hospital until you had a bowel movement. And I said, well, you're gonna be waiting a while. And I said, get a nurse in here too, and I can tell them how to do it. So I have this kind of innate fear in me
Hmm.
that ever I lose it cognitively and I'm in the hospital, and not that it's all bad, okay? I'm giving specific examples, okay?
Yeah.
But how do I stay one step ahead of them
Yeah.
and but educate them, because as you can see, I'm very vocal.
Hmm.
But if I lose that ability, how how do I educate? Where's the starting point to educate the medical staff?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you, Denise. Thank you. You know, let's first acknowledge that, damn it, you shouldn't need to be teaching frigging medical professionals how to care for someone with a disability. I mean, it is an outrageous irony. So let's, you know, let's start there. Uh, and yet, I'm with you. The truth is, even if you're not trying to be altruistic and improve the world, just trying to get the care you need as a disabled
Exactly.
person, you are often going to be in this position where you need to you're not only there to receive care, but you have to teach. That is, I'd say, sadly, a common issue, refrain, or common problem. Sadly, because again, in the medical system, I think that's just not good enough. Um,
Okay.
but
Can I ask another question real quick?
yeah, well, yeah,
Is there any, is there anything logistically, and this is going on the other perspective, that if ever I was in a car accident and I lost my ability to speak, is there anything that I can carry with me that
yeah,
would let the medical profession know that even if I can't speak and move my body, that I'm still cognizant?
yes,
Because if I'm laying on a stretcher and I get separated from my family members, or they got injured another way, they may not know what I'm capable of doing.
yep, yep. So, okay, so a couple thoughts. I mean, you bring up a lot of good points, Denise. So one is just so, for starters, we'll circle back to the second question. The answer is yes, that there is a way to prime people in emergency situations for what you might need. So let's circle back to that. But before that, I mean, so once we accept the idea that you got to have to frigging teach people, even though they should know. One is, taking what I'm sure you do, sort of being proactive. When you first meet a doctor, saying, hey, I know that disability is tricky in the healthcare system, and there's not a lot of training. So let me just tell you some things about what I need and how my body works. Very
Okay.
often, we as a disabled person are the experts of our bodies in ways that the people charged to help us just don't know. So I would suggest, to the degree you feel comfortable, Denise, and you probably already do this, is right up front, whenever you meet a new clinician of any stripe, sit them down. They're there to serve you, and you can say, hey, here's some things I need you to appreciate. And you'll get a quick sense if they're like, yeah, oh, well, great, thank you. A good clinician should really actively want this information. But if you run into power trippy junk, the degree you're possible, you can call them out on this, and say, hey, I don't think you're listening, and try to push it. But I also, I wouldn't wait too long before you look for a different doctor.
Okay.
That
I
all
don't
makes, what's that?
I don't see it so much in the doctors. I see it more if I go to if I'm actually admitted to the hospital.
Yep, get you. You mean like the nurses and the aides and all the staff?
Yeah.
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 Well, have you tried that sort of same approach when you go to the hospital, sort of minute one, saying, hey guys, here's some things I need you to understand?
Yeah, and I've tried to tell them for example, and this is going on another thing, like it's easier to do a dead man lift on me than to use a Hoyer lift because my Hoyer lift is non-compatible to yours, and I can't move my body to get your sling underneath me.
Yeah.
And so they just don't have a clue, and they say, well, sorry, when I'm saying you have to come in our sling and all that kind of thing. And I feel like I always have to be one step ahead.
Well,
So with
yeah.
your expertise and stuff, all I'm asking is, how do we start taking tiny steps as a collaborative um disability community or whatever? And if anybody can know, because you're a doctor, so it's like
Yeah.
you're like the best of the best.
Well, so yeah, so here's what's happened at UCSF, where I went to school and worked. Um, I and a handful of other folks, we advocated for an advisory committee directly to the chancellor around disability issues when I was a med student. That happened.
Okay.
So the made sort of structural reporting, changed the reporting structure so information from disabled students and patients could flow to the top. That was one big thing. We
Okay.
started in the medical curriculum early, year 1, year 2 of med school, that we have a day of disability issues with a panel of people like yourself and myself teaching the students about our experiences, having conversations like the one we're having now. So there are efforts like
Okay.
that to indoctrinate medical students earlier so they can develop these sensitivities earlier. So I'm not sure where you are, Denise, in the world physically, but if you wanted to, so you getting the care you need, like you're saying, being proactive, describing what you need, demanding what you need, and if they're not listening to you, asking pretty quickly to speak to the nurse manager is usually a person who can make things happen, not just taking it. But then if you also want to do sort of structural work, like we're talking, you might reach out to the local med school and call their Department of Medical Education, some places,
Okay.
or the Office of Disability, and see if they have one. And that can be a place to say, hey, I'm in the community. We know that I just want to volunteer myself for classes or lectures or panels where I can come and help teach students. That kind of thing can be beautiful, and it's been effective. I've seen it be effective at UCSF. So those are some structural things to be done. But I think a lot of
Okay.
it is just sharing your experience like you're doing here, talking about it. When things go right or wrong at a medical institution, if you have the time to write a letter and report back, this is how people learn. Again, I just want to acknowledge it puts you in a position to do all this extra work, but I think it's to the degree that you're interested in doing that, I think it's very valuable. And I have found younger med students these days have been very receptive, who want to learn these things. So, so then Denise, about your point about how, so an advanced directive, do you have an advanced directive? Does that name ring?
No, I don't. Not at this point, I don't.
Okay. So this may be one thing you want to look into. You know, all of us as adults should have an advanced directive because we never know when shit's going to hit the fan, excuse the French. So an advanced directive just is a way to document our wishes for care. So that if we're in an accident and we can't speak for ourselves, this advanced directive document to some degree can speak for us. So I would point you to fill out an advanced directive, and most advanced directive forms have a place where you can write in sort of special instructions besides the broad strokes of like you want a feeding tube, you want to be resuscitated, other big stroke things. You can also say, well, here's how I need to be lifted, or I need to be turned every so often, or I prefer to be on my left side. You can put those details into an advanced directive. And then there are services like mydirectives.com, Vinca, other ways that your doctor can upload this document into the medical record. So I would push you to fill out an advanced directive and make sure your doctors have a copy of it, and anyone who loves you has a copy of it, like your family, friends, so that they can present this document if need be. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, Denise. Yeah, and then the last point of that question too is to make sure, whether it's family or friends, is to name who's your champion. Who, if you can't say for yourself, if you're incapacitated, you'll have this advanced directive document speaking for you. But even more importantly is to have a person who in real time can advocate for you, who knows your needs and knows your wishes. So I would point you to name, this is called the healthcare proxy, or durable power of attorney for healthcare. Do those names ring a bell?
Um, I know I'm kind of familiar with the advanced care directives, but I'm not aware of the proxy part yet. But I
Okay.
will look it up and take it from there. Thank you.
Yeah, Denise, that would be great. If you name that person, then they are deputized, legally deputized to speak for you and advocate for you. So they are the ones who can really police things and make sure you're getting the care that's right for you. So that's a really important piece of the puzzle. And any advanced care directive will ask you that question. It'll prompt you to name this proxy. So the bottom line is get yourself an advanced directive and work that progress. You can come visit us at Mettle Health. We can walk you through that in a session. There are websites like Join Cake, My Directives, or all sorts of stuff that'll come up if you Google advanced directives. Are you in California?
No, I'm in Wisconsin, an hour and 15 minutes away from, or 2 hours and 15 minutes away from Chicago.
Okay, like near Milwaukee?
Yes.
Yeah, lovely. I used to live there. Say hi
But
to
more closer to Madison.
beautiful, beautiful. Well, all right. Well, say hi to Wisconsin, Denise, and thank you so much for speaking up. And if more questions, or reach out to us if we want to go in further detail together.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we've had quite a, oh, sorry, BJ, what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say, any other questions or?
Yeah, we've had quite a few things come in, and Denise, a lot of love for you in the question area here as well. So the next question that came in is, do you have any advice for how to deal with abusive family who refuse to ever stop?
Refuse to ever stop
I'm
being abused.
assuming being abusive about, yeah.
Oh, that's a tough. Well, first of all, the question suggests some real hardship and misery under there. So just to acknowledge that, depends on the details. I mean, you know, abusive in the way that a law would see abuse. Well, Adult Protective Services, APS. I mean, there are state authorities that, if we're talking, abuse at levels that rises to the level of a danger to you, I would call Adult Protective Services. That can be really tricky, but that is the sort of structural way to get help. If you're really, if you're concerned for your own safety, and things are in an acute mess, just call 911, get your ass to a hospital. Any emergency room will have social workers and case managers and legal frameworks for, so if you say, and anyone presents to an ER and say, I am afraid for my safety because of X, Y, and Z, there's a legal binding process to protect you. Of course, it's clunky and of course it's bureaucratic, but it's there and it's pretty functional in the acute sense. So there's gradations here of abuse. But that just want you to know, if you're really concerned, don't mess around. 911, get to an ER, get help. Okay, so we're talking in general terms. If the abuse is if there's a lot of love in the mix and it's just a lack of understanding, and you really want to work on this, maybe discussion, a facilitated conversation with a therapist, with some folks like us at Mental Health, with a healthcare professional who understands sort of the medical issues and the legal frameworks and can facilitate broker some better understanding within a family. That may be a way to go. If the abuse is sort of accidental, people are meaning well and want to learn. So I wouldn't ever underestimate what good family therapy could do there. So those are that's some generic spectrum response. Please chime back in if there's any more specific details that we can go a little bit deeper on. But yeah, I am so sorry. That's not okay. Again, please do chime back if I'm missing a beat here with more details.
And let's see, some other questions came in. This person said, when I'm out in my scooter, I get different reactions. A glance is fine, kids are fine, but when adults stare with that freak look on their face, I have a reaction. I feel really angry. How do you deal emotionally with people's reactions?
Yeah, not well sometimes. If I'm in a decent mood, it's not hard for me to see it as their junk, not mine, not take it personally, and either just ignore it, or, and maybe this is as a 6'3" man may be easier for me, but sometimes I'll get up in people's faces. I think there's something actually, anger is not fun, but sometimes there's a time and a place for it. So if I'm in the mood, I'll get up in people's grill about it, and push back. So what are you staring at? And I'll just stare at them or make them feel uncomfortable. So sometimes I get a little aggro. I'm not saying that's always a good idea, and you must, of course, keep your safety in mind. But one way or another, not just taking it is sometimes the order of the day. So depending on my mood, I'll either just keep on trucking, just let it fall off my back because it's their shit, not mine, and I got stuff to do. But I usually try to take a moment if I'm deflecting like that to make sure I actually deflect, so I don't let it seep in and affect my own, because that can ruin a day. It can turn on all my self-loathing buttons, and I start taking it personally, and what did I do, and what's wrong, my life sucks, and down I'll go. So if I'm blowing past some junk like that, I do try to take a moment and make sure I'm actually really deflecting it, not absorbing it. It's not mine. So now I'll let them ruin my day. Otherwise, maybe an educational moment. Hey, when you stare like that, here's how I feel. It's not very polite. Do you have a question? And if things are getting testy, sometimes you want to reveal more anger than sort of the educational stance. But please keep your safety in mind. But one way or another, I try to either deflect or educate. Those seem to be the two best options in a day-to-day way.
Okay, I know we want some follow-up to the question about family abuse, and I'm going to try to get those details here. 1 second. And then we've got a hand up from Esther, so let me unmute Esther. Esther, you might have to unmute yourself on your end.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it just was just a couple quick thoughts coming up. Just so much from the whole dialogue, and yeah, really lots of heartfelt, I don't know, energy going out to everybody. It's really, I feel quite humbled and privileged to be part of this discussion today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just one quick thought just around dealing with the medical profession.
Mhm.
Or the medical model, the medical world, that world. I wondered just if some of that piece, and it's just a thought, if that piece of needing to educate and is because, as you had said, BJ, of the homogeneous nature of, you know, what we would consider, and I'm doing air quotes, disability. And not that that makes it any better or it excuses anything at all, because that opens a whole doorway to how really we as a whole species ought to really take into account that we are individuals with individual stories, and so to be open to that, and already on top of that, you know, that an individual shouldn't need to be ahead of that we already that just should be part of the mix.
Yeah.
And then also just that world, it seems to me, having recently come up against it myself in a completely different way, there's a lot of meta rules and cultures and subcultures within the medical community. So cultures of doctors, cultures of nurses, you know, kind of unwritten rules and way that things are and stories. And I wonder if that can have impact. So sometimes people don't want to be educated.
Yeah.
They might take offense to that. They might think, hey, are you telling me how to do my job? A simple question, or asking, hey, do you know? Like, it can be really a bit of a minefield sometimes. And I just, you know, I thought that might be important to throw into the mix maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I think that can maybe make it further frustrating for folks and challenging, and then, you know, people get shut down, or maybe become leading into, you know, segueing into abuse. There may be, I don't know, and maybe not, but possibilities of being, you know, on the receiving end of what I would consider to be abusive behavior. So things being taken away, you know, service not being as quick as maybe it has been in the past, or for other folks, or, you know, I don't know what I'm stumbling around what I'm trying to say. I'm not being very articulate around it, and it leads into the idea that abuse can be quite subtle sometimes, including psychological abuse. And I'm in Canada, so I don't know what it's like in the States, but I think there ought to be legislation around that in terms of, you know, domestic violence. Psychological violence is still violence. However, in a medical setting, stuff can get real subtle, and also in the home, it can get real subtle. If, you know, maybe your meal doesn't come quite on time, or maybe it's late, or maybe it's not edible, or maybe it's cold, maybe there are financial restrictions that happen. You know, maybe you sit just a little longer in a, you know, pile of your own, or whatever it is, just a little bit longer. I don't know. That's not very cheerful, but just to add into the mix some of those challenges, I guess, or possibilities, and yeah.
Well, yeah, no, that's right. I think I'm with you. I mean, I think, you know, one of my concerns about a conversation like today is, you know, we have an hour, and when I say things, well, like you have to educate, blah, blah, blah. You know, this doesn't give, and that may still be the answer to practice what we're left to do, but that doesn't begin to touch the emotional load that goes with it, and the subtle and obvious sort of threats to our sense of self and how it makes us feel about ourselves, and how we find ourselves dependent on people that we don't respect and they don't respect us. I mean, it can be just brutally difficult. So I don't want to, I really would hate to sort of send a cheery, pat, tidy, well, if you bump into people, assume they mean well and just teach them and everything will be better. No, we know it's not that easy. So no, I appreciate you deepening it and just giving some voice to the exhaust that goes with this path.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I certainly do not want to, I did not mean to indicate that I thought there was anything pat going on or that there's anything wrong with that, or just those were some of the thoughts that were coming up for me.
Yeah.
And I also have to, say that I would be considered an able-bodied person. Like I'm coming into this conversation, you know, and that we're talking about physically. So then, maybe there's a whole discussion about what is disability, and maybe this was another thought. One of the ways is that we can be conscious or spread consciousness around the places where we meet. Places where we meet just as human beings on the planet. So opening up conversations about, well, what is disability? And not to detract. This is not, I offer it humbly and stumblingly, likely, not to detract from people's experience or the value and pride of their conditions or disabilities or whatever it might be ever. To look for where we meet and where we might be able to have a way into each other's stories or go, okay, well, oh yeah, this disables me, whatever it might be, and so maybe I can extend my understanding, to you.
Well,
I'm shutting up now.
okay, that's awesome. I love seeing your name up there, Esther. So no, this is beautiful. So I think you're right on. I mean, one of the points here is that, we've said this before in this setting, which is independence, dependence. We all humans need each other. We all need help, so when you really start opening it up, the line between able-bodied and disabled is very blurry. And that's good news in a way, as you're pointing, because we all, it's down to, yes, there's this great overlapping Venn diagram of human experience where we can really extrapolate from my life to yours, and we can know that there's a shared experience in there, and there's some shared forces, like things don't always go our way, like things can be hard, and like that we get sick, and and it's also true that we have particulars that need deference and respect. So it's all of the above, all is true, and our empathy and our understanding can get us very far. And at some point we also have to say, gosh, I don't know what that feels like. So maybe it's worth a real quick second here to coach anyone else who's able-bodied on the call, is like, as an able-bodied person who wants to be useful, wants to be helpful, wants to participate and be a good citizen, how to do that. We haven't really talked about that. That's an important question. So just like anything else. Oh, sorry, Esther, did I interrupt you?
No, I'm sorry, I'm just agreeing with you. I'm going, yeah, absolutely, because I think sometimes that can feel like a minefield also.
Okay.
Knowing how to, wanting to, as you just said. Does that make sense?
Totally. So I think the name of the game here is humility, curiosity, and respect. So if someone screams at me when I'm walking down the street, "Hey, nice legs," or "Hey, what happened to you?" I get shit like that. It's just and people will stop me and demand to know what happened. I'm like, it's just stunning. That's very different from someone who is approaching me and say, "Gosh, do you have a minute? I'm so interested by your legs. Do you mind sharing what happened?" Or, if someone's coming at you with respect and curiosity and deference, it's a very different experience. So it's not so much what to ask as how you ask it. And even if you ask it all the right ways, you still might bump into someone who's just on their last nerve, who's exhausted, who may just shut you down for asking. but that's okay. On this end, on the other end of things, try not to take that personally either. So sort of approaching with respect, humility, and curiosity will get you very, very far in this world. And that's how I think almost all of our divides should be bridged.